nodes, what happens here? So the dendritic cell, so it's sampled surroundings and say it encountered, it was at the site of the infection. So these dendritic cells, they can actually migrate through lymph nodes. Again, the lymphatics systems and lymphatic vessels. So what does it encounter when it's in the lymph node? Well, remember that slide a few lectures back with all that complex histology of lymph nodes? So it has T cells and B cells. So not only does it have T cells and B cells, but they're untrained T cells and B cells. So they're kind of like pre-nursing, pre-med, pre-pharm, pre-PT students. They're not quite fully trained yet. So dendritic cells, what do they do there? Remember, they're professional APCs, so they have the MHC class 2 receptors. So they're going to take all that samples of the pathogens and their surroundings that they found, everything that's foreign, and they're going to display it on these MHC class 2 receptors. So here we have all these I'm just showing T cells for simplicity, but they're called naive T cells. Now, misconception, naive does not mean stupid. Naive just means unlearned. So they're not fully trained yet. It doesn't mean they're stupid, they just haven't learned what they need to yet. So naive T cells are just like our pre-health majors, right? They're not quite full professionals yet, they're learning. So these professional antigen presenting cells, these dendritic cells, they're like your professors. What do? We take this material, we digest it, and then present it to you to help train you for your future jobs. That's why we're professionals. So naive T cells, mnemonic time. So T cells mature in the thymus. B cells mature in the bone marrow. Hey, T cells, thymus. So T cells, T and T. B cells, bone marrow. So B and B. So again, naive does not mean stupid, it means unlearned. So again, they haven't encountered their pathogen or antigen yet, but they're trying to train themselves to learn the antigen so they can carry out their function. So these have the potential to recognize the antigen. So they're hanging out in these lymph nodes, hoping that their number gets called, hoping that their antigen that they've been trained to recognize their life does show up in the body, so they can actually become what we call effector cells. So these are cells that are actually active and mounting an immune response against an active pathogen. So again, they have not yet bound to an antigen yet if they're naive, but once a dendritic cell, say they do have the potential to recognize this new pathogen. So when the dendritic cell comes along, it's going to present this new pathogen that it's been waiting all its life to recognize, and that's when they stop becoming naive, and that's when they become learned. So they activate and mature if a professional APC presents the correct antigen. So the thing is that naive T cells and B cells, they're only really trained to recognize one specific chemical structure. They're not going to be all-arounders. They can't recognize every single type of pathogen and antigen. They're actually very, very specific. So a lot of these naive T and B cells, their time never comes, so they never get activated and they eventually die. So here we have a dendritic cell, MHC class 2 receptor. So if we have a naive T cell, it needs to recognize that exact antigen. So here we have, I'm representing antigens in color, so there's no match here. So this naive T cell doesn't get activated. Let's go on to the next naive T cell. Is it going to recognize? Again, no match, so move on. No match. But how about this? Is there a match? Nope. And then we have this naive T cell. Hey, it recognized the antigen. We have a match. So now this naive T cell can graduate from being naive and finally become active. So what's one possible fate? There's actually several things that can happen, but one thing that can happen when a naive T cell encounters this match, like we have here. So yeah, the naive T cell is really happy. Now it can finally graduate. Now it can finally be activated. So what's one thing naive T cells can do? So naive T cells can mature, and one thing that it can mature into is a cytotoxic T cell. So cytotoxic T cells, what do they do? So cytotoxic T cells are not the same thing as NK cells. Get that out of your mind, okay? So this is a common point of confusion. Cytotoxic T cells, these are part of your adaptive immune response. NK cells are part of your innate immune response. So again, NK cells are more general purpose, but cytotoxic T cells, these are very, very specific. So infected cells, not only do they or cells in general, not only do they display their own proteins, but if you have an infected cell, it can also display proteins from things that it's infected with. Here we have a virus infecting the cell. Now its MHC class 1 receptors are displaying this viral proteins. So cytotoxic T cells detect pathogen antigens. So again, now we have cytotoxic T cell, and this one has been trained to detect this virus. It's like, hey, I recognize this antigen. This is actually a foreign antigen that I've been trained to recognize. So it's going to say, okay, this is a viral protein that I recognize. This is suspicious. I'm going to kill this cell that's infected with this virus protein. And then this cell goes under apoptosis, thereby preventing the virus from spreading from the cell and replicating, and then infecting other cells as well. Now, dendritic cells, so remember, they activate naive T cells. Again, the thing is about naive T cells, not only can they become cytotoxic T cells, they also have another way they can change. They can also mature into another different form called the T helper T cells. Now, if you take in immunology, yes, there's Th1, Th2, Th17 cells. We're not getting into that. Again, there's a reason why immunology is a semester course. Helper T cells, we're going to go very, very general. So what do helper T cells do? So the thing about helper T cells, they actually don't participate in attacking a pathogen directly. If you play games like Overwatch or League of Legends, they're like a support class. So again, they're not really there to be in active combat, but they're there to actually help other people and buff them, right? So helper T cells are like that in your immune system. They're there to kind of buff the other cells and make them more potent. So one thing they can do, they can tell cytotoxic T cells to replicate and proliferate. So instead of having just a small immune response, now you have more of these cytotoxic T cells. Another thing they help, so remember our big eaters are macrophages. So not only do they help them proliferate, they also make them more active, and also help them increase their ability to defend and attack other pathogens as well. So they're kind of like there as a support class. But again, this helper T cell is not actually attacking the pathogen itself. Now let's talk